This is the I Read Comic Books podcast. I am your host, Mike Rappin. With me this week, two wonderful human beings, Kara Shimborski.
Hey.
And Paul Jasley.
Hello.
Thank you both for joining me this week. I'm very excited to talk to both of you because you know what? After this week, I'm gone for 3 weeks because I'm going to be in Japan and traveling, and I didn't think that I'd get back in 2 weeks, but I didn't think that the Sunday I get back, I would actually be a functional human being to be on the show. So Paul, this magnificent person, is taking over. You know, you're going to be running the show for a bit. I think actually Brian or somebody's going to be running it for the Goodreads episode, but I'm going to be gone for 3 weeks. So this is my last episode before I turn 31. This is the last episode before I go to Japan. This is like a monumental thing in my brain for some reason. So I'm so glad to be here with the both of you today.
It's an honor.
Your life is such a whirlwind, Mike.
Yeah, it's my honor to be here, Mike. In that case, so.
Thank you so much. Well, let's get into it. Let's talk about comic books that we're excited about. That we have been reading. Let me ask the question I ask every single week: how have you been? How have comic books been? Let's start with you, Kara.
Okay, so I don't know how familiar you guys are with Shira, the character.
I've seen like a handful of episodes of the new Netflix series.
Okay, so for our listeners who are not aware, cast your mind back to the 80s where everything was super toyetic, and if it could be made into toys, it was a cartoon aimed at children. And if you're familiar with He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, just like super, super brawny fantasy stuff, completely to make toys, the quote-unquote girl version of that was Shira, Princess of Power. And I only knew about this when it was like in college and I was on 80stees.com way too often, but not actually buying anything. This was my exposure to Shira because that's not my generation. But there is the Netflix series Shira and the Princesses of Power, which I like way too belatedly found out was basically the brainchild of Noelle Stevenson, which how was I not watching this before? I love her work. Yeah. Her comic Nimona is phenomenal. I will never stop talking about her like one shot in that short-lived Wonder Woman series Sensation Comics, where she had young Diana like emerging from the ocean and just like going to the arcade on the boardwalk and beating up some bullies. Superb. Anyway, so I am, as of this week, caught up on She-Ra and the Princesses of Power. There are 3 seasons, and my eyes are still puffy from the tears because the end of season 3 is so emotional, and I wasn't expecting this from it's directed towards kids. Like, I needed this show in my life when I was about 10, but it doesn't talk down, and there's so much nuance. Like the bad dude Hordak, like by season 3, he becomes kind of sympathetic in a Severus Snape kind of way, where you kind of want him to find true love, but you also recognize he's a dick. And like, I had a really uncomfortable moment in this one episode where his like exoskeleton armor is stripped away, and he's literally and emotionally vulnerable to like one of the girl characters who's trying to help fix him. And I'm like, this is terrible, and I love it. And I'm finding him attractive, and I'm comfortable with this because I recognize he's a murderer. Is this why I like Anakin Skywalker? I'm so confused. I have so many problems. Anyway, so this is my life right now, is getting like way too emotional over She-Ra and the Princesses of Power. Highly recommend.
That's awesome. I watched the first like 3 episodes of that. I really enjoyed what I watched, but just I only have so much time in my life for TV. Plus, Kelly and I are watching it together, so I didn't want to watch it without her, all that kind of stuff. It's good to hear that it gets really, really good.
Oh, it's so good. In terms of comics, the last time I was on this show, y'all mentioned Supermutant Magic Academy by Jillian Tamaki. And I read it, and I think I heard the part where it was basically like sort of X-Men-y, sort of Harry Potter-y, and that was enough for me. But I didn't quite grasp that it was sort of in the philosophical comic strip vein of Peanuts and Calvin and Hobbes.
Yeah.
I got that vibe hugely because there's sort of a sequence to the events, but most of it is these disconnected one-shots, but all of them are like kind of profound, even if they're in really superficial ways. And there's so many pages in this book that just blew my mind. And so probably I shouldn't have been reading it after crying at the end of season 3 of Shira, but there I was. And so now I'm just like in this weird cosmic zone of who are we? What are we doing here? Is reality what we think it is? And it's all because of this book. So thanks for the rec. I can co-sign this.
Yes, that book, it floors me. Like, I want to just, every once in a while, I pick it up and just kind of flip to a random strip, because that's, like, the best part about it is it's just a series of, like, single or 1 or 2 page strips. And, man, it's so fantastic. Just little jokes all over the place. And people being kind of rude because everyone's teenagers, but also it's really, really wholesome. Like, characters very much care about each other, like this whole circle of friends in the book. It's so fantastic.
Yeah, my favorite characters are definitely Frances, who's like the deadpan artist girl who puts everything into her art. Mm-hmm. And you want to laugh at her for being an intense caricature, but you can't because she's doing like real shit. Like she's doing the art, and like I can't help but respect her. I get Lucy vibes off of her, like Lucy from Peanuts, even though their characters are different. And the other character I like is the Everlasting Boy. And he never really interacts with other people except for like kind of towards the end where there's a quest thing that he intercedes on. But you basically just see all these strips of him being eternal and him like just constantly dying and being reborn. And you got to figure that's got to be kind of rough. Like it's like the Edward Cullen thing in Twilight, where you're like, man, you've been a teenager for like 100 years. That must suck. But this kid has been a teenager for centuries, if not millennia, and has to die and like decompose in order to recompose. And I'm just like, man, are you okay? Do you need a hug? An ice cream cone? Can we help?
All of these things. He needs all of them. Oh, that sounds... I'm so glad that you enjoyed it. I'm very glad that you enjoyed it. Paul, I'm going to just throw that out there. Pick it up on Hoopla or something, man. It's very fun.
I did a few times pick it up when I was at the library and flipped through it, but I never actually checked it out. So you've convinced me to go back and grab it. So
Yes. Nice. Paul, what about you? How have you been? How have comic books been?
I've been doing great, Mike. We're in that nice... part in Michigan weather where we're actually getting autumn for a couple weeks before it becomes a desolate winter wasteland. So I'm enjoying that. I like the fact I have to put on a sweater before I go on my morning walks with my dog Phyllis. That's actually I really enjoy that this time of year. So
awesome.
Yeah. I know it's funny because that's happening and I'm like, yeah, this is great. And then in the back of my head, I'm like, boy, I really have to go get my snowblower fixed. So I'm already preparing for the snow apocalypse. So anyway. In terms of comics, comics have been pretty good for the most part. I went down a nostalgic path recently, and I was at my local shop flipping through the dollar bin, and I found the 5 issues of 0 Hour: The Crisis in Time, the miniseries that DC did back in 1994 for their big crossover event that year. I bought these when they came out. So summer of 94, I was about 12 years old. Going to the local comic shop regularly at that time. I remember buying these 5 issues of 0 Hour, and I read them, but I literally could not remember anything about them. So when I saw them in the dollar bin, I decided to gamble my $5, pick them up, and it wasn't very good. There's a reason I didn't remember it.
I just remember that. Like, I don't think I actually read that event, but DC referenced it almost constantly for the next, 20 years, 30 years?
Yeah, it's so weird because it's the Crisis in Time. So it's clearly they're referencing, Crisis on Infinite Earths, which is a groundbreaking series. It's kind of hit or miss, but it's culturally and historically important, I guess, for DC. But 0 Hour literally changes nothing. Like, it's the most nothing event. So the fact that they try to make it seem important by calling it a crisis... is pretty funny. The one thing I do remember about this, again, it's 1994, so it's a 5-issue miniseries, but it's numbered 43210. So the first issue is issue 4, and issue 5 is issue 0.
Comic collectors just all pulling their hair out, trying to figure out like what's the actual order here because databases are going crazy. This is number 4, but it's actually number 1. Oh yeah.
And then that month they did every title they published had a 0 issue, which basically introduced the new status quo. So I remember buying a bunch of those at the same time. Anyway, it's by Dan Jurgens and Jerry Ordway, they're like journeyman creators. They've been around the business forever. they were running the Superman books around the same time, so I read a ton of their books. And the thing is, like, it's not objectively bad, it's just boring. And I think that's even more offensive to me. How do you make a superhero comic boring? Right? That seems worse than a bad superhero comic. So, as spoilers for a 25-year-old comic, it turns out that the mastermind behind the whole Crisis in Time was the evil Hal Jordan, a.k.a. Parallax, who destroyed time and then rebuilt the universe. I don't know. It's very confusing. And for some reason, I was compelled to read all 5 issues. I'm not sure why, but I did. So,
ooh, since you did, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Is this where Lady Blackhawk is reintroduced?
No, I didn't see her in this mini at all. It could have been, part of the event in a crossover book. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I feel like that's where she came in, because I remember reading Birds of Prey when Gail Simone was doing it like 10 years ago and loving the character of Lady Blackhawk and being like, where did you come from? You're like literally from the 40s. And I think I read somewhere she like reappeared in the DCU during 0 Hour, and that's how she became like time displaced from World War II.
That makes sense, because that's kind of how they realign a bunch of stuff. They have the Justice Society of America show up in this, and they get re-aged since they had been de-aged, so now they're 80 years old instead of 40 years old, and then some of them die, but whatever. I don't know. It was just funny rereading it, because I was like, I don't remember any of this, and I realized why. And it's an example of joyless superhero comics, which I find so much more offensive than bad superhero comics. So anyway,
interesting.
It's let me do this. You're warning against nostalgia, right? Nostalgia isn't the path to go down very often. On the other hand, I read Legion of Superheroes Millennium #2. This is the second of the 2-issue mini that Brian Michael Bendis is doing to relaunch the Legion of Superheroes. I was pretty critical of the first issue a few weeks ago on this podcast. I thought it was pretty underwhelming. I'm here to say that issue 2 was fantastic and I loved it. So, again, the gimmick here is that Brian Michael Bendis has taken a D-list DC character, Rose Forrester, a.k.a. Rose and Thorn. She has like a split personality. Thorn is the evil version, obviously. Rose is the nice version. If you didn't catch that.
I got
there.
Turns out she's immortal, so basically getting her first-hand perspective of traveling basically through time to through the various future iterations of the DC universe. In this issue, she goes to the 25th century. Well, I mean, she doesn't go there. She lives through the 25th century. She visits the Space Museum, runs into a security guard who, of course, attentive readers will recognize as Michael Carter, who worked at the Space Museum in the 25th century, stole a time machine, came back to the 20th century, and became Booster Gold. And then after that section, she runs into OMAC. So anytime you have a comic that you have Booster Gold and OMAC showing up, I'm on board, right? What's great is that they have different artists for each section. So Nicola Scott does the Space Museum section, and then Jim Cheng does the OMAC section. And he starts his section with an homage to that double-page spread from OMAC #1, right? Where OMAC is just yelling, I am OMAC, evacuate the section, I'm going to destroy it. It's the best.
That's awesome.
I loved it. And then eventually by the end of the book, she meets up with the Legion of Superheroes in the 31st century. So it's a cool cliffhanger leading into the ongoing Legion series that Brian Michael Bendis is going to do with Ryan Sook that's starting next month. The idea that, in the 31st century, here's a character, Rose Forrester, who kind of remembers everything from the 20th century on, could kind of like bring a message to the Legion of Superheroes. It's a cool way to kind of tie the whole various futures of the DC universe together into one whole. So I was surprised how much I enjoyed it. This is a counterexample. This isn't just joyless superhero comics. This is a lot of fun. Brian Michael Bendis clearly loves writing this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And I'm on board for the new Legion of Superheroes book. I never thought I'd say that. Much like the X-Men, I never thought I'd get into the Legion of Superheroes, but here we are. I'm hooked.
Cue Bob Dylan's Times Are Changing. And
perfect.
Well, for me, I've been doing all right. I actually sat down with Tia on Thursday and recorded like what we're calling a microsode about the Wicked and Divine After Party, or Wicked and Divine Wake, where we kind of just talked about the night and how fantastic it was. It's going to go up on the Patreon this weekend, so like probably before this episode is even out, it's going to be up on Patreon. But so if you're not on Patreon, you can get that. But otherwise, I've just been been chilling, prepping to go to Japan and reading some comic books. I sat down and read Strayed number 2 and 3. Just really quick, I got a copy of issue 3 before it comes out this week from Carlos Cafoni, and this book is really fun. If you haven't checked it out, it's from Dark Horse. The art's by Juan Doe. It's lettered by Matt Kreutzer. And all I can say is it's a kitty in space. It's a cat going, flying through space, trying to find this alien race that can help the human race potentially live forever, or at least that's what the nefarious overlord of the human race right now is saying to our main character. It's got a little bit of a sad twinge going on to it. I'm waiting for the shoe to fall and be real sad, but otherwise it's a real fun book, and the art in this book is fucking incredible. I just want to say that if you just go to your shop, pick this up, the art is stupendous. Check out the previews on Comixology or something. It's amazing. But the book I really want to talk about is No One Left to Fight, numbers 1 through 3. This is by Aubrey Sitterson on writing, with Fico Ossio on art, and art by, I'm going to butcher these names, or this name, Raciel Avila or something. I'm sorry, I'm trying. But the subtitle to this book on the cover of every issue is The Comic You Always Wanted. Which, okay, cool. And I remember seeing Aubrey Sitterson talk about this, in his newsletter, and on Facebook and stuff, and I saw a handful of posts about it. I was like, oh, this looks really cool, and I picked up all the issues, or it picked up 1 through 3, I should say. And the story is essentially, what if all of the cool, badass characters from your favorite anime and cartoon shows grew up, and it's been 10 years since they saved the world? What does that world look like? What do those characters look like? It's not like a weird, bleak dystopian future. Instead, it's, everyone has cool outfits and headbands, and they carry guns, and everything about them looks really action figure-y and super anime. But they're now 10 years older, and they've come back together for a reason that we really actually don't know yet. Our main character, his name is Vale. He meets up with his old, I guess, co-fighters in the saving of the world, Timur and Krista. The two of them, they're married, and they have kids, and they have to go on some trip to somewhere. We don't really know what the answer is to that. And something is wrong with Vale. He's not explaining it to anybody. He's having these weird flashbacks or flash forwards of potential futures. And as the story goes on, we start to get a little bit more detail about the world, about what Vale did to save the world, the villain that he fought. And this is it's a book that hits on a lot of anime things, where if you liked any kind of super action-packed fighting story, and then you had to take a step back and flash forward at 10 years, you get a lot of the fallout of the drama between characters, lost loves or missed connections between people. And the art in this book is fucking stupendous. It's by far the most colorful book on the stands right now. And we have The Weatherman, which is out there, and that book's really bright and colorful. Christian Ward is out there making books. This book is the most neon, badass looking book you can buy. And it's super detailed. I don't know how Fico Ossio does this book, because there's no way you can make this on month to month timeline. So if you haven't had a chance to check this out, I really, really recommend No One Left to Fight. It's so over the top, but very full of heart. The characters, you really, really feel for them. There's a lot of really tropey, I guess, drama moments where our main character Vale is in love with his former frenemy / rival Timur, who's now married to Krista, and it's a whole thing. So maybe I think I said that wrong. Vale is in love with Krista, who is Timur's wife, and it's a whole thing. It's fantastic, and we meet some other
Jesse's
characters.
Girl thing.
Yeah, and I mean, we meet another person they used to fight alongside of, and then we meet Vale's old master, and we meet all these different things. It's a really, really well done book that totally nails the cover subtitle of The Comic Book You Always Wanted, because it very much feels like the next step in a story that you didn't read the first part of, but you never feel super out of the story, because they do a really good job of filling you in throughout it. So I really recommend this book. I've been sitting on it for a bit, and I was very pleasantly surprised at how easy of a read it was, despite the obvious huge story that this world exists in. You really, really are able to understand the characters well, and then get little tidbits of the actual background of each of the characters as the story goes on. So I'd recommend it if you're looking for just something that's way over the top. Like, the art itself will blind you. Like, I was reading it in the dark, and I was just like, oh god, there's so many pinks and greens and yellows. Like, it's awesome.
You sold me, Mike.
I mean,
once again,
try it. I don't know. I don't think it will be for everybody. Like, Aubrey Sitterson, I think, also did a book about wrestling last year. And he's done a bunch of other stuff. He's been very outspoken against Comicsgate, which has gotten him like kind of a weird rep of being just incredibly outspoken. But I think he's a fantastic writer. So I really would recommend this. Just check out the first issue, and if you like that, you're gonna love issues 2 and 3 for sure.
Got it. Cool.
But let's move on. Let's talk about the comics we're actually excited about this upcoming week. Comic books are dropping on October 16, 2019. What are you both excited for this week? Let's start with you, Paul.
I'm excited for Superman Smashes the Klan, #1. I think this is 2 or 3 issue miniseries that Jean Lewin Yang is writing for DC. It's got art by the collective of Gurihiru, a Japanese team that does art. And basically, I don't know what else to say besides the title alone should sell you. It's Superman fighting the Ku Klux Klan. Who doesn't want to see that?
I'm here.
Exactly.
Yeah,
it's
same.
Essentially, basically, it's based on a Superman radio serial they did back in the late 40s called Clan of the Fiery Cross. And that was inspired by the leftist activist Stetson Kennedy, who infiltrated the Ku Klux Klan. And the creators of the Superman radio program used a lot of like his research to make a show where Superman fought. It wasn't explicitly called the Ku Klux Klan, but it had enough of references to it that folks could pick up on the references there. So
the white hooded men out in the forest.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's not that's not that subtle. But so Gene Yang is kind of updating that story. It's set in the 40s. The artwork you've seen in the promo images, it's the same outfit that Superman wears in those like Max Fleischer cartoons from the 40s. You know, a very like stylized look. It looks great. And it's about a Chinese American family that lives in Metropolis. They're getting hassled by the Klan. One of their kids ends up getting kidnapped, and Superman teams up with them to kind of fight the Klan. So again, in my personal life, I like to consider myself a pacifist. I kind of abhor violence, but if you're going to make a comic book that's just Superman punching Klan goons in the face for 20 pages, sold. You know what I mean? Like that's
Oh yeah.
Give me that. So I'm very excited for this book. As soon as it was announced, I was excited for it, and it's coming out next week. So I'm here for it.
Nice. Yeah. Kara, what about you? What are you excited for?
Revenger, the Halloween special. Let me tell you. Okay, so I don't know if y'all are familiar with the Revenger series. Charles Forsman does, I think, the entire thing himself, like drawing, covers, inks, everything. And it's kind of like I'm getting like 80s indie vibes style-wise, or like 80s indie update vibes, like books like Copra or early Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, where it's like kind of sketchy and gritty, but the motion telegraphs really well. Anyway, so Revenger is basically like Grace Jones if Grace Jones was a like vigilante assassin for hire kind of situation, where if you want revenge on someone, you can hire her and she's the Revenger and will get revenge for you. There's lots of violence. It's super, like, much like Paul, I'm not a fan of violence, but I'm a fan of Revenger because it's a really, really solid book. And I'm so excited there's a Halloween special coming out this week. The solicit basically implies that Revenger will be fighting a vampire, and I think that's something that anyone can get behind.
Oh, yeah.
That sounds awesome. I think I read the first 3 issues of Revenger back when it first came out. And one of those books I've always been meaning to go back and revisit, so thanks for reminding me about it.
Oh, yeah.
I love that Charles Forsman does like the real like moody stuff, like I'm Not Okay With This or The End of the Fucking World, and then he does these hyper violent revenge comics. Like, it's two extremes. It's great.
I didn't know that End of the Fucking World is a Netflix series now.
Yeah.
I like totally missed that, and then I was looking at his Twitter to like double check the release date for Revenger, and there's all this End of the Fucking World stuff, and I'm like, well, good for you.
Yeah.
Good for you, Charles.
Yeah, dude's doing okay, I think.
Yeah, it must be.
But yeah, Revenger Halloween special. Get on that.
Very cool. Well, for me this week, I am excited. Just play the very sad horn. X-Men #1. This is Jonathan Hickman with Lionel Francis Yu. All I could say is after the end of Powers of X #6, like, come the fuck on, Hickman. Come the fuck on, my dude. Yeah, I can't not read this book. Like, it's obvious that I'm going to pick it up, but also, given everything that was said and done in reflection from House of X to Powers of X, #6 for both series, I just want to fucking fall down and cry for a month because holy shit, man. I don't want to spoil it. Really, everybody out there should go and read House of X and Powers of X because it is the most X-Men thing ever in like the best of ways. Like, the most X-Men thing ever would be like, oh no, and then Mojo showed up, but it turns out he has the brain of Charles Xavier from another dimension. Like, that would be the most X-Men thing ever. But instead, it's an ending that is so fitting for the X-Men. I should have seen it coming 10 miles away, and yet I didn't. So to jump into X-Men #1, I really want to see what Hickman's going to do with this book. Holy smokes. Paul, did you get a chance to read Powers of X #6?
Not yet. I'm
okay.
actually planning on running down to my comic shop as soon as we're done recording to buy it. It's kind of
awesome.
Been to the shop yet this week, so I'm very excited. I'm stunned how much I'm enjoying this stuff. Again, as an X-Men newbie, so more or less, the fact that Hickman's been able to do something that is pleasing hardcore longtime fans and someone like me is pretty amazing.
Yeah, dude. I honestly would love to have like a mini-sode or something just to pick your brain about where you're sitting with the X-Men
Sure.
coming off of House of X and Powers of X. But we'll figure that out another time. But man, I'm excited for X-Men #1. I'm really excited for all the X books that are coming out. But X-Men #1 starting things off is going to lead into a pretty honest or pretty solid winter as far as I'm concerned. Like, this is the only thing that's going to keep me waking up every day and going to work because, like, I know that X-Men's coming out and I'm very excited about it.
I'm sure your wife would like to hear that. That's the only thing keeping you going is the X-Men.
Yeah. She's not staring at me with the stink eye. No, it's fine. But, all right, we're going to actually take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about comic book letters pages and what it means to be in communication with comic book creators through the slowest way possible, as well as what goes on in the back of a book after you finish the comic. So we're going to talk about all that in just a moment. For our show this week, we are talking about comic book letters pages. It's a very, very niche topic because I know that a lot of people out there don't necessarily read single issues, and this kind of thing, like the letters page, really only ever shows up in single issue comics. So if you have never read a single issue comic, I'm very, very sorry that we're going to alienate you for a little bit to talk about something that is very specific to single issue comics. But it is a crucial part of the comic books industry as far as I'm concerned because it allows people to talk to comic book creators in a public space, which is kind of mind-boggling. But I know we were kind of talking about this before the show started, and I know Kara and Paul, you had some different thoughts, but Kara, I wanted to toss this over to you because we were talking about like the slow back and forth between, the comic book and then the letter getting to somebody. Like, snail mail is still insane that people still do it, but I don't know. What do you guys think about comic book letter pages?
Okay, so
let's just open that can of worms up right now.
Yeah.
So like you said, the comic book letters page is a super niche topic because it is a super niche thing. The letters page for single issue comic books has always been a place where the creators of the book can build a community and a rapport with their fans. And I think that since we on this podcast strive to create a community space for comic fans, it's appropriate for us to talk about this because the whole point of the letters page is building community, and not even just between fans and creators, but between fans themselves. A recent example that comes to mind is the letters page for Bitch Planet. And Bitch Planet, of course, being the comic where women who are deemed non-compliant get sent to a prison world, and they're branded with this NC for non-compliant marker to show that they have disrupted society's expectations of them. So the letters page for Bitch Planet was flooded with pictures of women who had been so inspired by this book that they went out and got the non-compliant tattoo. And so that was a way for everyone who was reading the book to see, oh, other people are also strongly affected by this book. Because so a few minutes ago you said, well, this is a way for people to interact with creators in a public space, and listeners might be thinking, well, Mike, there's Twitter for that now. Why do we need a letters page? But with the letters page, you have like a focused forum that the audience that is buying the book every month is going to see that. Whereas on Twitter, like, sure, you could go and stalk a creator page and look at their tweets and replies and try to like figure out what's happening. But there's more of a defined narrative on the letters page itself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why I kind of wanted to focus on this is because I think it's something that's slightly gone to the wayside over the years, right? It's something that, I think was crucial back in the 60s and 70s and 80s to say, I don't have any other way to say how much I like this comic, or to ask some arbitrary question to this comic book creator or the editors or whatever of this book, to say, Spider-Man on page 9 of issue 647 did this, that was for the longest time the only forum before something like Twitter, or even, comic book forums, like the Warren Ellis message board, for instance, came into being. So there wasn't a really good way to actually pick the brain of these creators, or even just say, hey, I really love this book. You made me realize that I too could be a blind lawyer, something like that. So it's interesting to see that it still exists to this day, because it is like, we do have Twitter, or we do have more prevalent comic conventions, or like live Q&As that people do on Twitch or YouTube or whatever. But still to this day, we see books that have letters pages. And I think maybe it's the reason why it still exists. I have kind of my own thoughts, but I was curious to know what you guys thought about it, or if you still read letters pages for the books that have them, because I know that not all of them have letters pages, especially at like the big two. I don't even know if DC does letters pages anymore.
I can't picture any book DC does that has a letters page that I'm reading, at least. And I'm trying to, I don't read many Marvel books to begin with, but the only big two book I can imagine having a letter page is Immortal Hulk, of the books I'm reading, right? Mm-hmm. Which I love, because the lead up to that book, before the first issue even came out, was Al Ewing posting stuff on Twitter, like his notes, basically. These are the things I'm researching for this book. So it generated an excitement about what the book was going to be. And then it makes sense for that book to have a letters page, because it's a complex book. It's a very different direction for the character. And it's Al Ewing, I think, is a creator who really enjoys having feedback and picking people's brains about stuff. So that said, I very rarely read any of the letters on the letters page. I don't know. It's not part of my regular comic book reading habit. I skim through it if something stands out, or if I'm kind of more interested in the creator's response to the letters maybe than the letters themselves,
Yeah,
because
I get that.
The other books I read that they're not traditional letters pages, but a book like Criminal, there are any of the Ed Brubaker books, there are, he'll write to the audience, like, here's what I'm into, here's what I'm watching, here's what I'm reading. You get a one-sided sort of account, and every once in a while he'll post a letter or an email he got from a reader. So it's a more curated form of a letters page, I guess. I think that's more attuned to my reading habits than the traditional letters page.
Gotcha.
Marvel's Unbeatable Squirrel Girl has a letters page, and it's the most wholesome. There's like people send in pictures of their daughters wearing homemade Squirrel Girl costumes, and people like write quirky letters about their love of squirrels and about the character, and it's one of the only letters pages that I think I've seen in the last decade that has been more all ages focused. When I think of recent letters pages that I think are done well, I think of like any of the Brian K. Vaughan letters pages, any of the Kieran Gillen letters pages, like because those are they do tend to start out kind of like what Paul was saying, where it's like, here was my thought process for this, and like a little bit more behind the scenes, but then also getting into some fan feedback and sometimes responding to that in ways that are just so interesting to see, like the R.I.P. the Wicked and the Divine, like in those letters pages, Kieran Gillen would do like a whole page being like, okay, this issue just happened. I'm sorry. Am I? Let's process together, and then get into the letters page of like people's reactions. And sometimes he'd drop little like hints in there. So that was a way to feel like a part of the that community of people reading the book. Even if you weren't involved online, you could still read the letters page and feel like, I'm not the only one.
Yeah.
And I like that function of, I think letters pages, maybe because of, we're reading comics now in the age of social media. And, as someone who started reading comics in the 90s, like I kind of saw letters pages kind of fade away, because around the time I was starting to read comics, there was a letters page, but also you had the rise of, message boards and AOL chat rooms kind of taking the place of that stuff,
Yeah.
But I love, in theory, the idea of the letters page creating a community or breaking down that distinction between the creator and the reader. And that goes all the way back to, Stan Lee doing the Stan Soapbox on every letters page back in the 60s. Like that was his attempt to say, like, Marvel didn't have the capital or publishing a number of books that DC did, so the way that they were able to create an audience was doing that, saying like, hey, we have the soapbox, there's the bullpen, making the readers feel a connection to the creators and the characters in a way that was only mediated through a letters page. So, I mean, historically, I love the concept of letters page, even if in theory or in practice, even if in practice I don't really read them. So.
Yeah. That's really interesting, because when I first started getting into single issue comics, right? Back when I was, first going to a comic book shop and I was picking up, single issue books for the first time, the two big books that I was picking up, I was, buying my Marvels and all that stuff, but I bought Invincible and Walking Dead, and those books have massive letters pages. They've always had massive letters pages, I know both of those books have ended, but while I was reading it, like I would finish the issue and then I would spend another 20 or 30 minutes reading all the letters, all the responses, waiting for something, to be, responded to. I mean, to the point where, the book that I wanted to talk about this because I'm proud that I wrote a letter and it got printed in a comic, and I think it was Astounding Wolfman number 13 or 16. I can't remember. I have the issue somewhere. And, I wrote a letter to ask a question to Robert Kirkman. Like, it was a very, like, super geeky, like, in the nitty gritty of the Kirkman universe, superhero universe thing. And I asked the question and he responded like with a nice little paragraph. I thought it was so interesting to actually participate in that community that I had been reading so vehemently for years, to say, okay, I'm actually going to write a letter in and maybe it's going to get printed. Now of course I didn't mail anything in. I said snail mail earlier. Of course I emailed them, because that's how you do these things these days. But unless you're Brian K. Vaughan, in which he only takes paper submitted things sent to his P.O. box, which I think is hilarious. Because like Saga still has it to this day. Paper Girls had it from the beginning of the run to the end, though there's a big question mark on the Paper Girls one on whether or not it's actually real.
But that was the example I was going to bring up, because I thought that was such an ingenious use of the format of the letters page. Again, I would skim through it. I wouldn't read every letter, but just skimming through it, I had that question. It's like, are these legitimate letters, or is this clever ruse? And that added such another layer to the complexity of that book that I really loved. So
for listeners who are not familiar with Paper Girls, what was so different about the Paper Girls letter page?
It wasn't so much a letter page for the comic itself. It was I can't remember the abbreviation. It was the American Society of Paperboy, whatever. Like it was like people were writing letters to an organization.
Yeah.
Right. And then it started out as being an organization. All the letters were kind of written in a way or dated in a way that felt like they were being written in the 40s or 50s, right? And as the book went on, they got more contemporary. So it really felt like the letters were being written by either Brian K. Vaughan or someone else. They weren't actual letters of readers writing in. Instead, he was using that to draw sort of historical significance to the idea of the paper delivery kids. You know what I mean? but there'd be little hints and be like every once in a while someone would write in a letter that seemed legitimate, and the person responding to it was out of sync. You know what I mean? Like somebody asked a question that referenced something in contemporary pop culture, and the responder on the letters page, like, I don't know what you're talking about. You know what I mean? Like, because I'm in the 50s and I don't know who Lizzo is. Like, you know what I mean? Like that's like, so it added that such a unique take to the book. But then also Brian K. Vaughan would also have things where he would ask fans to cut out a page of the comic and mail it in and stuff. So
they do the Q&A for Saga where you had to do that.
Yeah,
the reader surveys, right?
Yeah, and it's such an interesting thing, to see comic book creators like Brian K. Vaughan still trying to really heavily push that idea of the letters page, because the Saga letters page, as far as I'm concerned, is like probably one of the most prolific letters pages in comics, because they take fan submissions of like cosplay, and they take submissions of these surveys and all sorts of other things. And like I said, Brian K. Vaughan is like, if you're gonna do this, you gotta mail it to my P.O. box, and he lists it in big bold letters at the end of the issue, and I love that. Like he's really trying to push it. And I know that other comic book creators that really want to build an audience, or feel like they need to build an audience in order to make sure that the people stay on their book, they'll definitely be like, hey, send a submission for what you think the back of this letters page should be. Like, for instance, Rob Gilroy, he put out his book Farmhand. This is another series that I wrote into and my letter got printed. He was taking names for his the name of the back matter. And of course, I didn't have any questions about the book or any questions for him, but I sent an email with a couple of different ideas and told him how much I loved the book, and how much I appreciated that he was doing a book all on his own and all that stuff. And again, it's short little letters because I wanted to make sure I didn't take up too much paper or space on the page and all that stuff. But it's cool to see that, like, I think a lot of independent books are really trying to make sure that they curate that community to make sure that you feel like you're engaged, that you don't have to jump on Twitter or jump on somewhere else where your message may not be seen, but instead it's going to an inbox somewhere where there's a chance that someone read it or at least skimmed it to put it in the back of their book, which I think is really interesting. And that's 3/4 of it, just making sure there's that fan interaction, because as far as I know, when you send an email like that, it's just a blind email. You never get a response. Like a thanks for writing in. It's just, I'm going to send this thing into the void and fingers crossed it gets printed in the next issue of, the Weatherman or something like that.
Yeah.
But also to your point earlier where you said these are only, letter pages are only in singles and not collected in trades. This is a way that creators can try to add value to the floppy singles format, because so many people want to read trades, but it's that whole weird paradox of the American comic book industry where your book needs to be picked up in singles form usually before being made into a trade. So you need to get that early core audience on board so you can at least get like 6 issues out, so the publisher will go with the collected version. So a letters page is fulfilling that function of building community and also like helping people form an emotional attachment to the book, so they hopefully keep buying it so that it can continue to live.
Yeah. I mean, and there's also a bunch of stuff around the idea of, back matter in general in a lot of these single issue books is what you should be. It is like more of a reason for you to buy the single issues. Like, I think we've talked about it a million times on the show, but like the back matter in all of the criminal books and all of the books that Sean Phillips and Ed Brubaker have been putting together over the last few years always have a ton of back matter that I'm pretty sure does not get collected into the trade. If it does, please somebody out there correct me and let me know. But as far as I know, none of that stuff gets collected, like the essays and the beautiful little pages that Sean Phillips' son puts together for those pages, which I just that's half the reason to buy those single issues, just to see his art sometimes. But like all that back matter stuff is like more of a reason to push to buy the single issues. But I mean, it was in specific when it comes to letter pages, the thing that I find most interesting is what letters get actually printed, because obviously if you're getting 100 emails or 100 different messages about your book, you only have so much page space, so you have to really pick and choose which letters get printed, which is why I've always found, despite the kind of grossness that this book is, Savage Dragon to be a very interesting book about this, because Eric Larson, I've probably said this to a ton of different people, but Eric Larson prints a lot of letters in the back of his book, and he prints these huge long letters that people will write him, and then he'll give like a 2-sentence response to them. And it's in like 8-point font so that he can get the most out of his pages. I just remember at one point I was picking up Savage Dragon like years and years ago, just because it was like, a new 150 or whatever issue it was, and I was like, sure, let's try this. And I remember seeing those letters pages, and it was just like, holy shit, how does anybody sit here and read this whole letters page? There's so much content on it, it's bizarre.
But if that's your book, like, you're gonna sit down and read it, you know?
That's true.
Yeah, that's true. Or at least skim through with a magnifying glass to find your letter.
That's kind of going back to what I said earlier about with a letters page, the creator can build a narrative, and part of that is choosing which letters to highlight, because if they do have enough letters where they can curate a selection, then those choices say something about what the creator wants people to consider when they're reading their book.
Right. Or you're sex criminals and you just print everything, and you print the most wild fucking responses to every single letter that is both wholesome and in fucking sane at the same time somehow. Because between Matt and Chip, that book has some of the wildest letters pages you could ever read, which is why I think they put together their individual or their separate book. I think it was called Sex Tips or something like that. I mean, I know I'm getting it wrong. Or Just the Tip. Just the Tips, because they're dorks. And I think it contained some of their responses, and as well as other stuff that's actually like helpful in terms of having a healthy sex life, which I think is interesting. But the back matter of Sex Criminals is full of a lot of jokes, but also people writing in to say, hey, I'm a trans individual, and the way you represented this person was actually really positive. I'm glad that you did it that way. And then Matt will be like, I didn't want to fuck that up, so I spent like 3 months working with a bunch of trans individuals to make sure that the way I wrote this character wasn't just tropey and shitty. And I'm like, I appreciate someone writing in to say thank you, and then him going, I'm glad that you thought that, because I really didn't want to misrepresent you. And that, because that book has a lot of things around it that could be misrepresented or could easily fall into a bunch of different tropes and stuff about people's sexuality and their various fetishes and all that stuff. And we can laugh about some of it, but like some people enjoy that, and we shouldn't shame them for it. And I think that's what Matt and Chip want to do with their book, is as much as there's some goofy stuff, by no means are they trying to point a finger and say, haha, you're weird. They're saying, look at this thing, and that's kind of the end of the story. And to hear them acknowledge it in the letters pages, and to hear read people writing in saying, yes, thank you for doing that, I'm glad that you said that, is always really great. Or there was the whole issue where people just wrote in and talked about porn they found in the woods. That's also fun too. I mean, the Sex Criminals letters pages are worth it for the price of the book.
Well, yeah, I think that speaks again to the function of letters columns being a sort of curated space, as opposed to the wild tangled brush of social media, where the creator can say like, I'm not just screaming into the void of Twitter, I'm actually kind of creating a sort of dialogue between the readers and myself, to kind of foster some sort of debate or dialogue is of a higher caliber than what you might find on social media. So in that regard, I think it's. And I feel there are certain creators that really do that. I think Ed Brubaker does that because he's not on Twitter anymore. So that's the only really way he can contact, readers, is through his essays and the letters page there. But what I love, actually, again, going back to the history of letters columns, is whenever someone unearths an old letter that a creator or someone wrote to a comic, like, every once in a while they'll pop up on social media. Someone will find the letters that George Railroad Martin wrote to Stan and Jack. In the back of the Fantastic Four issues and stuff. And I remember I was in my floppy issues of Doom Patrol that I have. There's a couple letters from a Jeff Johns from Michigan. I'm like, I know who that is. You know what I mean? Like, it's just funny to see that, like, the creators, went through that same process and did write letters, and they got into it through that interaction.
Creators, they're just like us.
Go figure.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh man, I remember when I was a kid reading, surprise, Archie, but they had a letter from the editor column in the 90s in their digest and double digest, and I don't really remember the content of that page so much as I remember the header, because it was like the most hilariously 90s caricature of the editor, Victor Gorlick, and you just had like this wavy hair and these like cool shades, and like the whole look would not have gone amiss on Doug, and it was just like I have such a strong visual memory of this letters page because I was just like, oh, cool, people can write in, and always looking at the address and seeing that Archie was like literally right down the street from my house and being like, maybe I should write in, and I just like never did. But it was always nice to know like it's right there, and look, people do actually write from all over, and isn't that pleasant?
Yeah, I think being a part of comic book fandom, it's always an interesting reminder to see, how sort of, I don't want to say small, but how sort of like closely knit it is. You know what I mean? Like
totally.
In addition to letters columns we're talking about, Mike, you mentioned the prevalence of conventions and different varieties of conventions. Like seeing just everyone's kind of there's not many comic book readers, but everyone who's into it is pretty passionate about it. So like small reflections of that, like letters columns, are always heartwarming for me to see.
Yeah. That was actually, I was going to ask this question, it's kind of like the final thought on this episode was, have either of you ever written into a comic book? Because I said that I have, and I fortunately, I was printed. I've written into probably a dozen different books, but I was printed twice. Have you guys written any letters to any of your favorite comics?
I won't be able to remember the issue number or, in fact, the year, but I did write a letter to Radioactive Man, the Bongo comics. Remember the Simpsons comics in the 90s? So
yeah.
They did a Radioactive Man series. I remember writing a letter to them. I even drew a picture of Radioactive Man on the envelope, which is a whole other issue. Like the envelope art that people used to do for letters. Like, so.
Yeah.
I can't even tell you what I wrote, but I remember it getting published, and it was pretty exciting. So
that's awesome. Someone out there, scour those Bongo comics somewhere on some pirate site and let us know. It's unfortunate because I don't think all those Bongo books are like available in any digital format, which is kind of a bummer. Because there are some gems out there from the 90s that just never made it to digital, or at least if they have, I'm not aware of it.
That's the stuff I need to find in the dollar bin instead of this 0 hour crap. I need to find some more Bongo comics.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Kara, I know you said you never wrote into that Archie book, but did you write into anything else, like in your tenure of being a comic book reader?
Oh God, I am just the worst. Like I am that person who like won't go to a restaurant or buy a product without reading like all the product reviews and all that. And I really rely on these things, and I love reading letters, columns and stuff, but I just never put in the work to do my own. Like I've never
That's okay.
Like written a review for anything or write a letters page, and I'm just the worst consumer.
No, that's okay. Nothing says you have to participate. I mostly was just curious because, I'd love to hear if any listeners out there have written letters to folks. I know a lot of people that listen to our show, like they're involved in comics in some way, or they write reviews, or they, are very like prevalent on Goodreads to do things. But I'm curious to know if you've ever written into a comic, and gotten either a response or gotten your letter printed. That would be really cool. If you know the issue and stuff, I'd love to be able to check that out because I'm curious to know what people's relationship with comic books are, because to me that is the most interesting side of comic books in a lot of ways when it comes to the people that are actually consuming them. Because as you said, Paul, it's like a very small, tight-knit group of people, and that we're all very, very passionate. And to where that passion lies, like, why are you really into The Flash instead of being really into, Superman or something like that? That's the kind of stuff I want to hear. So if you're writing into a book, you must really, really care about it. In my case, I really, really loved Astounding Wolfman. I thought that was the most fun book that you could read at the time, and then it ended very abruptly. But still, it was that I wrote into that because I cared about it. I cared a lot about the book, the characters that Robert Kirkman was writing in that series, and like the established universe that he was building independent of Marvel and DC. And this is before, Valiant came around and they were like, we've got this big shared universe. And before I really got into Hellboy with their shared universe, it was like, I was so interested, and it felt like very personal to me that I was reading all the books and I knew all the stuff about all the characters at the time. And to this day, I couldn't tell you exactly what the letter was about. It was something about somebody could do some power with gravity, and I was like, why wouldn't they just do this thing in this one issue? Or in the future, do you see this person's power growing? Yada, yada, yada. I don't know. And Kirkman was like, maybe, we'll see. It was a very nice response. Like, I don't think he was sarcastic by any means. It was a very nice response. But I was curious because I really, really cared about it. So I'd really love to hear from other people if they've ever written in and had their stuff printed, or if you've participated in that saga thing. I don't want to damage my books and rip out the back page of it. So
right.
I never submitted it to anything. But maybe next time I'll like photocopy the back page and send it in to be like, I tried, Brian, I tried.
Not acceptable.
Oh man,
originals only, no facsimiles accepted.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, I guess. Do you guys have any final thoughts about letters pages, or do you think after this episode you'll maybe try to write into a book? Paul, do you think you're going to write into the Immortal Hulk? Because I think that would be really cool.
I feel shamed that I admitted that I don't read letters. I think maybe this is going to inspire me to maybe give them a closer peruse, at the end of the issue. And Immortal Hulk is probably one of the few books I feel passionate enough about right now to kind of write into Al Ewing and pick his brain. So yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, cool. What about you, Kara? I mean, any final thoughts about comic book letters pages?
I love them, but I don't see myself being an active participant in them. Like, I would have to be pretty moved to take the time to sit down. And I think all the time, like, maybe I should write in, but I don't know. Like, it never occurs to me to have something to really say, which I know is ironic because I'm on a comic book podcast, but it's like, I don't know. It's like, it's more personal if you're sitting down and taking the time to write something one-on-one.
Absolutely. What we need is a letters page for the Shira season 3 ending.
I have so many thoughts. Tweet me.
I look. I'm very, very excited to see your Medium article about this. I'm sure that will come out or something. But all that being said, I thank you guys for being on the episode. Let's wrap up here. You can follow us all on Twitter. You can follow Paul at Paul or Oh Hi Paulie. You can follow Kara at Kara SZM. You can follow me at Mike Rapp, and you can follow the show at IRCB Podcast, where we're on Twitter and on Instagram, and I try to post pretty regularly. It's a lot of fun stuff.
If you've been watching Shira and you have thoughts, please tweet me. I really want to talk about it.
Yes.
You can subscribe on our Patreon at patreon.com/IRCB podcast. Without your support, this show wouldn't survive. That sounds so desperate. We would love your support, please. Thank you. Join now for access to exclusive audio, articles, previews of the IRCB schedule, early access to top of my pile posts, and more. Our Goodreads group is a lovely community of comic friends, and we have weekly threads. Check it out at ircbpodcast.com/Goodreads.
Speaking of ircbpodcast.com, that's the home base. We have links to every episode, show notes, our pronunciation guide for comic book creators. Our Discord server link is over there. You can buy zines, merch. It's your one-stop shop for everything IRCB. If you haven't already, please rate and review the show. Not to press you, but 5 stars would be a good rating, I think. On iTunes or whatever platform you use. And if you do that, maybe we'll read your review on the next episode.
Speaking of, I actually want to read one really quick that we just got. This is from Mouth Dork. He said, perfect combo. Are you hungry for thoughtful conversation featuring a fresh perspective that doesn't fall into the same dull POV of so many comic book podcasts? Well, look no further. You found that voice. Sending much love from your friends at the Comic Book Couples Counseling Podcast. Thank you so much, Mouth Dork. I don't know who you are, but thank you for reviewing our show. That means so much to us.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. So thank you. So you can do the same by reviewing us on iTunes. You can also email the show with your thoughts on letters, columns, stuff you've been reading. If you have any recipes for vegan chili, it's getting that season again. If you have any comments, corrections, whatever, you can email us at ircbpodcast@gmail.com.
Infinity Shred is the best band in the universe. As I've said for the past couple of weeks, go check out their latest album. It is stupendous. Xander is a wizard. He's a great DM, high-fiver, and hugger. He's also the editor of our show. He is amazing. I want to say thank you to Kara and Paul for being on the show, and thank you to the listeners out there. Thank you to Andre, who sent that very, very nice email. That was so kind of you, really. And thank you to everyone else who hangs out with us on the Discord server and has wild conversations about D&D and all sorts of things. So until next time, comics are good, and so are you.